One of the most favored arguments by the opponents of Sola Scriptura is that Sola Scriptura is not in the Bible. Well, that argument is as weak as the atheist argument. Jesus never claimed to be God, saying that Jesus never said word for word that he is God. Even though he demonstrated that he is God and made undeniable claims of being God that is even more undeniable than simply saying, I am God. And the sola scriptura denier's argument is also as weak as the Muslims' argument. There is no Trinity in the Bible because the term Trinity does not show up in the Bible, even though the Bible clearly shows out God is a Trinity. So, what makes me say that the argument sola scriptura is not in the Bible is weak? It is because the Bible, just like the way it reveals the Trinity, doesn't say explicitly but demonstrates sola scriptura. Now, to properly define sola scriptura, it means that the information found in Scripture is the truth and the Scripture has the final authority. Also, sola scriptura doesn't mean that there cannot be any teachings not explicitly spelled out in the Scripture. It just means that all teachings and ideas must be tested using Scripture as a standard. Theological truths cannot be made up apart from what was already true from the beginning. And I don't think no one who claims to be Protestants, Catholics, or Orthodox would disagree that God cannot change. The disagreement is on whether or not the oral traditions have the authority at the same level as Scripture. Well, here's the thing about oral traditions. Catholics and Orthodox believe that the traditions came all the way back from Jesus himself, and that it was taught to the disciples but not written down. The problem is, to accept some oral traditions, Scripture must be taken out of context or its meanings altered heavily. However, that is not a problem for them. They claim that it is because they are the ones with the authority to interpret the Bible. This is very circular. Basically, the ones that decide that they are right are themselves, who they claim are the ones to have the exclusive authority to decide what is right. Then, how can they ever be wrong? This makes their belief system unfalsifiable. So before I get to how the Bible demonstrates sola scriptura, I will talk about the idea that there were Jesus' essential teachings that were left out of the scripture and were passed down only through verbal communication. And what I mean by essential teachings are informations that are essential to salvation and other extremely important concepts like the existence of another infallible source of God's words other than the scripture. Well, the claim of Jesus' essential teachings being left out is unreasonable for a variety of reasons. The first reason is that since there were a lot of perspectives involved, it is very unlikely that essential teachings would have been left out of the scripture. This is what I mean. There are 8 New Testament authors spread out through decades. Think about it. When one person tells a story, he might miss some important details, but as you add more storytellers, you start getting the fuller picture. The Gospels are exactly like that. The Gospels were written based on multiple eyewitnesses. Matthew was written from the eyewitness testimony of Matthew, Mark was written from Peter's, and John was from the perspectives of John's and possibly others. And here's the thing, Mark's is one of the biggest problems for Catholics. Since Peter should have been the most informed out of everyone since Catholics claim that he was the first pope, Peter, with the job to lead the church in the right way and prevent heresies, not telling Mark to write all the essential teachings of Jesus is not reasonable. But the real problem for both Catholic and Orthodox is Luke. It is because Luke was not an eyewitness himself, but he was doing an investigative report about Jesus. His gospel did not just come from a single eyewitness testimony. Instead, his came from the eyewitnesses from all over. Luke 1 verses 1 to 4 says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." This shows that Luke was a very carefully written report using eyewitness testimonies. And in Luke, there were no essential teachings that were not in the other Gospels, which means through all of those eyewitnesses, no one heard some teachings of Jesus that was not written down. Also, Luke wrote Acts as a report as well. It also didn't have any essential teachings of Jesus that were not present in the Gospels. And it was a time when Luke had lots of interactions with the apostles. Therefore, this makes it extremely unlikely that there were essential teachings of Jesus that were left out of Scripture. Of course, this just makes it unlikely for it to be true. Great for me though, I can make an argument that makes it impossible. The argument is that God doesn't make mistakes. Think about it. It would be a huge communication failure on God's part if some things as important as Marian dogmas or the idea of papacy were not in Scripture. It is because the purpose of the epistles is to teach how not to fall into heresies. Not a single statement like, go ask the Pope if you need anything clarified, or asking dead people to help you get help from Jesus will help you, or it is essential to believe that Mary is sinless, would be a huge failure if any of those were true. Why would such important theological truths that have huge impacts on how we come to understand how to be saved not show up in writings that are meant to teach us how to discern truth from heresy so that we can be saved? Doesn't God want people to be saved? And if Peter really did have that authority and role as important as Catholics would like to claim, then he had all the reason to write essential teachings down. He did write 2 epistles, so it wasn't like he was against the idea of writing down important teachings. So now that we went through the idea of essential teachings of Jesus not being mentioned in the Bible and how it is unlikely or even impossible, let's get into how the Bible demonstrates sola scriptura. First, let's discuss the function of the epistles. It was to correct misinformation and sinful behaviors going around in the church. They contain theological truths to be revealed to us in the form of letters written to the contemporary churches of the apostles' time. Those letters were written in responses to the problems in the church, to correct false teachings, and to rebuke church leaders who became heretical. And from Acts and the epistles, church leaders were indeed anointed with laying of hands. Catholics and Orthodox will confirm that all leaders must have been ordained. This creates a problem because the scripture shows us that ordained church leaders were sometimes downright heretical. The epistles responded to such big time, well known church leaders who were spreading false teachings. There were even these super apostles that Paul had to refute and call out for their heresies. They were not nobodies that just appeared out of nowhere. Instead, they were teachers accepted by a lot of people. And I hope everyone realizes that those church leaders would be what the modern day Catholic or Orthodox churches would consider as bishops. And having that many bishops in so many churches right from the beginning becoming corrupted is not good for the Catholics or Orthodox people. This shows that the scripture affirms that the church, people in the church, and even the appointed leaders were corruptible and needed corrections. And the method to correct all those problems was the epistles themselves. And well, the epistles are part of scripture, and it is exactly what Sola Scriptura claims. As said before, Sola Scriptura claims that all teachings and ideas must be tested out using the scripture as a standard. And Catholics and Orthodox claim that their own church resisted corruption while false churches were the ones that broke off from the church. However, we can see that the church, soon after it started, was becoming corrupted with false teachers and false theology. Wolves in sheep clothing were already entering into the church. That means that their church, from their point of view, was corrupted very early on, and since the scripture calls those churches church, not fake churches, their church was the one that was being corrected by the scripture. This goes against the idea that the infallible church is the ultimate authority to correct members of the church or influence the scripture in any way. Now, there's one possible argument that Catholics may use in response to all this. They ask, who gave you the Bible? Well, the church did not make the Bible. The canon is canon because it is scripture, not scripture is scripture because it is canon. I do believe that God used the church at the time of the canonization of the Bible. However, this doesn't mean that those people stayed inspired for the rest of their lives or had divine inspiration or authority passed down to them to pass on to the future generations. That is not how divine inspiration works. The apostles themselves were not infallible people with authority to pass down their infallibility down to other people. This is true, and we know it because Scripture warns us that even the apostles can teach heresies outside of the divine inspiration. Galatians 1 verses 6 to 9 says this: I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse. As we have already said, and so now I say again. If anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let them be under God's curse. Notice how Paul doesn't say, don't worry about it, you can always trust us to be correct theologically. Instead, he tells us how no one is safe from heresies, including the angels. And it is important to note that Galatians was one of the first epistles to be written, which means that the gospel that they were preaching was already firmly established and understood by the apostles already, which means that there would be absolutely no reason that the scriptures would not contain the full gospel already. Like Paul said, if anyone modifies the gospel even in the slightest, it is an act so bad that it deserves extreme consequences. In conclusion, the New Testament does not merely contain scripture, it models how truth is preserved. False ideas arise orally, correction comes through scripture, and no appeal is ever made to an infallible extra biblical authority. And that is what Sola Scriptura is. Thank you for watching, and I hope this answers some questions. Please subscribe and hit the like button. Bye bye.